2017 was a very tumultuous year in very many ways. But when Time magazine editors sat down to choose the person of the year, the person who had done the most to change the world in this amazing and, can we say, heartbreaking year, they didn't just choose one person, they chose a group of people, the silence breakers. The group of mostly women, but some men, who started to publicly identify with the hashtag #MeToo, or what the French often call balance ton porc, which is reveal your pig. It is a 2017 story that has been building, though, for years, centuries, really. Millions of years of evolution embedded impulses and appetites in all manner of life to reproduce through sexual intercourse. Birds and reptiles and mammals of all sorts have nesting rituals that their species will follow in order to continue to reproduce. But humans have complicated that process with what we call civilization, which is a bit of a misnomer since we seem to be so darned uncivilized about how we go about it. And the rules of engagement are different in different cultures and then in different centuries. We Westerners are often offended by the Muslim practice of insisting that women completely cover themselves, but those more conservative Muslims are equally shocked at how we appear to pressure the women in our society into wearing revealing clothes and covering themselves in makeup as if they were constantly on display for sexual intercourse. What seems like freedom and liberation in the West looks like exploitation in the Muslim world. And to be honest, most of the time it is. And what looks like repression and control in the Muslim world to us is in truth most often exactly that. Both are in some ways right, trying to respect women's freedom or trying to respect women's dignity, and both are in other ways horribly wrong, largely because it's generally men making decisions about how women should dress and act. But our own culture has been through massive evolution. About 20 years ago, I was scuba diving in the Bahamas, and one of our dives was on the submerged airplane that was a set in a James Bond movie, Thunderball. And when I came home, I rented, back 20 years ago, the VHS tape of the 1965 movie to show my then 8-year-old daughter where I'd been on vacation. But in the opening scenes, James Bond engages in what could only be called a rape scene with a masseuse that sent me scrambling for the VCR. Now, I'm sure that I had seen that movie when I was young, and the Bond character was designed for young men to be envious of 007's swagger, his self-confidence, and his success in seduction. But what looked like secret agent stuff in the 1960s was clearly rape, viewed in 1990. Now, that kind of confusion and evolution of how men and women engage in seduction produced the somewhat shocking result in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, when women were polled about whether they had ever been raped. And the most common response was, "I don't know." Now, sometimes that's because of alcohol or drugs, including the rape drugs of the Cosby variety, but sometimes it meant reflecting on their sexual encounters, there was some point at which they felt that they lost control, that they wouldn't have completed the act, but they were intimidated or forced or coerced into an act that they would not have chosen freely. Was it rape or was it not? Most responding women at the time said, "I'm not sure." The silence breakers in the closing months of 2017 have helped to usher into the public dialogue a long overdue conversation that can help us to clarify the rules of appropriate behavior going into the future. We've had other moments of sexual revolutions and revelations. Most memorable for me was the 1991 Clarence Thomas hearings that made an entire generation of men sit up and realize how sexual harassment in the workplace has not been seen as innocent flirtation or compliments to the recipients of that attention, but that it had in fact been sometimes absolutely torturous, that it was coercive, and that it had cursed women's lives ever since it became common for men and women to share office space. Though the Senate ended up seating Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, and we all know they shouldn't have, Anita Hill did not get personal validation in reward for the tremendous courage that she showed. She did wake up the world, and she started an entire industry of sexual boundary training in offices, universities, and even in churches. There have been other instances of forced awakening, such as when the Catholic priest sex abuse scandals began to break in the 1990s, and then was much less covered in the other denominations where it also took place. But the most recent cascade of public revelations began with the case of Bill Cosby, who, after fairly publicly discussed predatory behavior, it's been one of those secrets that everybody knows, that Bill Cosby did what he is alleged to have been doing, and a lot of people knew about it. It was actually a comedian that included conversation about that in a stand-up routine that made people begin to say, well, now, if that's really true, then more than 50 women came forward to report having been drugged and raped by a man who formerly was wildly popular and one of the most influential public figures in our country. In fact, when President Obama was elected, many social scientists were saying Bill Cosby and Oprah made it possible for white people to get over the hurdle of their racism to vote for a black man. But the accounts of Bill Cosby's life went far beyond the category of the casting couch exploitation and into an arena that meant that surely he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And so far, he hasn't been convicted. His first trial was declared a mistrial, and I still believe he'll probably end up in prison, but not yet. Now, Bill Cosby's sins, I think to most of us, seem like an outlier. It was almost too weird to have any impact on the garden variety of workplace sexual harassment. Politicians and corporate bosses sometimes make a splash in the news when they are found to have availed themselves usually of the services of male or female sex workers, or if their compulsive and lewd behaviors reach the level of the repeated offenses of the rather ironically named former Congressman Anthony Weiner. But the most perplexing of recent revelations was when the infamous Access Hollywood tape was made public just weeks before last November's election, or 2016 election. In that tape, Donald Trump literally bragged about having forced himself on women. He claimed to have committed assault in the most disgusting of language, and even bragged of pedophilia. And it's interesting to me that this hasn't even been discussed as much, but he bragged about regularly walking into the dressing room of teen beauty contestants who were naked. So he was going in purposefully to look at the naked bodies of 13 and 14 and 15-year-old girls. And honestly, I know several young men who are in prison serving terms of 10 to 15 years for having looked at underage women on the internet. But Donald Trump not only confessed to having done it in person, but he bragged about it. And weeks after that was revealed, he was elected President of the United States. And even now, the allegations that have come out this week that he has paid hush money to porn stars for sexual encounters doesn't appear to be, I mean, this is like buried news. We have come to accept that one embarrassing thing after another happens at the top of the ladder while we're putting other people in prison. The entertainer, Billy Bush, who's related to the Bush presidential family, was Trump's host on the Access Hollywood event. And even though he was egging him on, Billy Bush was promptly fired for listening to what Donald Trump said. So the TV stations were taking more responsibility than voters took on who we were willing to put into the Oval Office. However, his inauguration, regardless of what his administration said, was one of the most lightly attended inaugurations in history. The following day, we had the largest demonstration in the history of the world, the Women's March that came out in protest, not just across America, but across the world. In every major city in the world, there were major protests in reaction to Donald Trump's inauguration. Now, Clarence Thomas is a Supreme Court justice. Bill Cosby is still free. Donald Trump is, at least temporarily, the President of the United States. But change about sexual harassment and predatory behaviors is in the wind. And if we don't mess it up, this is a time for real change, at least in America and in Europe. The conversation is alive if we handle it right. There are, I believe, two ways in which this movement could quickly fail and fade into memory before it makes substantive progress. The first is if we lose sight of the revolution and allow it to turn into revenge. The other is losing the moral high ground of an appeal for ethics by becoming indifferent about ethics. Let me explain. For many years, the world protested the system of apartheid in South Africa. It was obvious that racial discrimination, violence, and the oppression of the black majority in South Africa was wrong, but the white government in control kept militarily reinforcing apartheid because they feared, quite reasonably, that the moment they took their boots off the throats of the black residents of South Africa, that the Africans would take revenge against the white South Africans. It was a very reasonable expectation. The only thing that made it possible to bring apartheid to an end without the white minority simply fleeing the country and taking almost all of the nation's wealth with them was to give them a kind of revolution that allowed people to confess their sins and be forgiven. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed people to admit that what they had done was wrong without unbearable retribution. And it hasn't been perfect. South Africa is still one of the only countries in the world that has more gun violence than the United States. But there was not a bloody civil war, which we had every reason to expect. They are making progress. But you know, folks, and this is one of the things, I'm an idealist, and I can be gored on the horns of wanting things to be perfect. But progress rarely goes in a straight line. You take a couple of steps forward, and there's usually a step back. And, you know, we elected the first black president, and then we elected the first open racist in 150 years. You know, you had, like many of you, I sat in the room at the watch party in 2008 and wept that we finally reached the point where we could elect a black president. And then we elect Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean that we've lost the battle. We've taken a setback, but it doesn't mean that we've lost the progress that we had made at that point. We're not likely in the United States to fall into a gender-based civil war, but we do run the risk of bomb throwing that will leave more innocent victims than targets on the battlefield. When the Harvey Weinstein case went public, we saw the seamy underbelly of the entertainment industry at its most creepy. And some of the complaints against him were for sexual harassment, but some were for out-and-out exploitation. And in some cases, you would have to call it sexual assault or rape. And I don't even know, where did the phrase non-consensual sex come from? Isn't non-consensual sex rape? Isn't that what it is? I don't even know why we try to avoid the use of the more accurate term. So an almost daily chorus of Me Too victims came forward to reveal that Harvey Weinstein was a real monster. I don't know if everyone that complained against him was telling the truth, but enough of them were that it became clear. Now, seeing that a titan of the industry could be brought down gave courage to others to file complaints against other well-known personalities. And frankly, a lot of them came as a shock to me. They just didn't seem the type, which, I'm sorry, ladies, it just kind of shows how thick men can be. I mean, I didn't see Mark Halpern as being that creepy. I couldn't believe that Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer, who seemed to me to be as benign as everybody's kind of boring uncle, but boy, did they ever have skeletons in their closets. I didn't find it hard to believe that Louis C.K. needed help, and I would have believed absolutely anything about Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly. But I didn't want to believe it about Kevin Spacey, and I didn't want to believe it about John Conyers. But the evidence points to the reality that they too are guilty of serious offenses. In the past few months, more than 50 high-profile politicians, actors, producers, and musicians have been revealed, and most of them have lost their jobs, and their careers and reputations have been ruined. Some of them will see jail time. But still, I want to emphasize that this is not a movement that has just affected the Megyn Kellys and Gwyneth Paltrows of the world. The familiar household names of the news and entertainment world can open the door to millions of complaints that will be lodged from places like hotel chambermaids, waitresses, migrant farm workers. Absolutely everyone that has to work for tips has been subjected to sexual harassment. Their stories have to be heard, and their demands for justice must be recognized. And of course, this is not a matter of always the powerful exploiting the vulnerable. Most sexual harassment does not happen between an employer and an employee. Most of the daily painful comments, stares, and sexual suggestions come from fellow workers or come from customers. It's the whole workplace environment that has to undergo meaningful reformation, from the shopping mall to McDonald's, from the local Ford plant to the TV newsroom. It's not enough to send Bill Cosby to prison and kick Kevin Spacey to the curb and stop showing reruns of House of Cards. It is not high-profile revenge that will satisfy these century-old injustices. It is change. It's not revenge that we want, it is change. Change in the way that powerful people use their power. Change in the way that people that are spending money and giving tips presume that those tips give them permission that they clearly do not have. We need to change the way that both men and women, gay and straight, go about the intricate dance of pairing. No means no. Derision is not flirtation. Lewd suggestions are not jokes. Unwanted sexual harassment, sexual attention is harassment, period, full stop. But the second issue is more complicated and possibly more dangerous, and more dangerous especially for a straight guy to try to talk about it. But I will beg your indulgence to allow me to say a bit about ethics. You cannot meaningfully, simultaneously air your grievances for ethical violations while insisting that ethical violations against others are inconsequential. Bill Cosby, Bill O'Reilly, Harvey Weinstein, Charlie Rose were evidently sexual offenders on a criminal scale. People like Anthony Weiner, Mark Halpern, Louis C.K. seem to me to be mentally ill, deserving of treatment. But do Al Franken and Garrison Keillor deserve to be tarred with the same brush as these rapists, predators, and exhibitionists? I don't know what his history was, but if in his 90s George H.W. Bush won't keep his hands to himself, then I think his family needs to keep his wheelchair away from the backside of young actresses to try to keep his reputation out of the news. But still, George H.W. Bush is no Harvey Weinstein. Everyone deserves to be heard, but not everything you will hear is true. I've done marriage and divorce counseling for nearly 40 years, and I can tell you that almost everyone tells their own story in a way that portrays themselves heroically and portrays their enemies or adversaries as monsters. Very many of those stories are exaggerations, and some of them are out-and-out fabrications. In some cases, we will never know the truth. At least 8 women came forward to accuse Judge Roy Moore of inappropriate sexual harassment or outright pedophilia, but none of them had any evidence that would have made any headway in a courtroom. 8 women, regardless of what my older brother said about it at the time, is not hearsay. But 8 accusers still doesn't become a criminal conviction, though it becomes a persuasive case to not vote for him. For centuries, women have been ignored. And that was wrong. That was very wrong. That was terribly wrong. But it would not be right then in reverse to assume that everyone who has a story to tell is telling the truth. Victims deserve to be heard, and the accused deserve the right to defend themselves. I would not argue that Al Franken was innocent. In fact, he clearly was not. He was acting like a child. I would say that he didn't get a fair hearing, and that his life and political career was sacrificed in one of the most ridiculous examples of hypocrisy that I have ever witnessed. Democrats would not have sacrificed Al Franken if there had not been a Democratic governor in his state who could appoint a Democratic candidate to his seat. They simply used him as an example. In a civilized society, we know that some offenses are deserving of a warning, some deserve a fine, some incarceration, and there are some crimes for which our society even chooses execution. I don't personally believe in capital punishment, but in the recent abduction and murder case here in Springfield, the jury has decided to ask for the death penalty. But we never execute criminals for minor offenses. Ethics demands that the punishment fit the crime. And I know that there are very many victims, numbering in the hundreds of millions, who don't feel much sympathy for the innocent people whose lives will be ruined in this revolution. But I want to warn you, substantive change is accomplished in a revolution that maintains its credibility. And it has to be fair to maintain credibility. It could all backfire. Rather than being granted an equal role in the workplace, employers might choose to do what they did 50 and 60 years ago, which is not hire women to work in male-dominated areas. Executives might not include junior executives who are women in business travel or in those Saturday golf rounds where networking takes place and where promotions are born. We want for men to respect women, but we don't want men to fear women. We want those who are guilty of offenses to be appropriately punished, but we do not want to punish every man for being male, even if there's a long history of every woman being punished for not being male. Revenge has a certain appeal. Trust me, I've felt it. But I submit that revenge is its own worst enemy. Somewhere between the Hooters uniform and the hijab, somewhere between the Playboy Mansion and the celibate monastery, there is a rational, compassionate, and fair place where men and women can be fully who they are, and yet where everyone can work, engage in commerce, and even meet their future significant other in a safe environment where everyone is respected and where no one has to sacrifice either their bodies or their self-respect. And that's the place that we have to get to, because nothing else is acceptable. We owe a debt of gratitude to the silence breakers who have set this reformation in motion. And so I want to ask today for your applause to be for those people who have set us on a path of greater justice.
Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos.
We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.